I say when we were big in chipsets, all of a sudden, we're amazing, look at us, stock prices going up, all these customers and everything like that, and then, things changed.
Raphael, have you had any transitional experiences?
I would say that my life has been pretty much one transition after the other. I was born in the Philippines originally, and at the age of 7, I moved over to the UK. And so going from the Philippines, from my family, from the friends that I had there, to sort of this new country was something that I had trouble with initially, with the language, with just understanding different customs. Like for example, I trained myself to eat with a fork for 6 months, after I first arrived, just because like we're used to sort of eating with our hands. And I guess throughout my educational experience, especially when I went into uni, I was initially interested in doing sort of politics, philosophy, these kind of sort of social science subjects. But then after 6 months of doing that, I realized that okay, this isn't for me at all. So that's when I started to investigate what it is that I actually enjoyed. I looked at tech, and I did a coding class and I really liked it. I figured that I wanted to do tech, but I didn't know exactly which field I wanted to go into. So I did a bit of data science, which I really enjoyed. Software engineering, I got into that. What was interesting at the end was, I applied for a program. There was a listing from VIA. It was more of sort of a software engineering role. And so I applied to the program thinking that I was applying for that. But then the person who was in charge of this program said, oh, there's an opportunity open in the marketing department. When I first heard that, I was very surprised. And I didn't even actually know what marketing was. I had this idea that it was just making like banner ads. Once I actually got in, got stuck in doing marketing, I realized that there's a lot more to sort of marketing. I could still do a lot of the techie stuff, but also the business stuff was something that I realized I enjoyed a lot more as well. I think with tech, sometimes a lot of my friends who are very techie have this tendency of just doing tech for the sake of tech. Whereas I realized with marketing, everything sort of has a purpose. I would say that going into sort of the full-time role now, I think that I'm still going through these transitions, and especially with the transition that we're sort of going through, there's a lot of things that, to be honest, I still don't quite understand. Which I guess I guess that's a good sort of opportunity to ask you directly now, sort of what this transition that we're experiencing now actually means.
I think there's a lot of things I don't understand either.
Yeah, sure.
And, I think that's what makes the job interesting. Why we are living in a very interesting time. I mean, I think it was Mark Anderson who talked about software eating the world. And he said it quite a few years ago, and I think it became a big catchphrase that everybody talk about it. But it takes a while for the implications of that. It was very clear to me that we needed these new kind of skills to come in. The technical skills, computing skills were a lot more important than they were previously. And so this was part of the shift that we were making in the marketing. I think as you've seen from the job, actually, it's becoming more and more software intensive, more and more data intensive.
Richard, speaking of transitions, can you talk a little bit about some of the big transitions that VIA as a company has gone through?
I'd say the biggest transition we went through was when we moved from silicon design to embedded systems. In some ways, having the silicon design background was extremely beneficial because it meant that we could optimize the technology very effectively, had very good graphic skills, very good connectivity. So in that sense, it was relatively smooth. On the other hand, though, it was a very different business model. It's like basically with silicon, we were selling to Taiwan motherboard makers and also some of the big US and European PC OEMs. So it was a very high volume business, and it was very dependent on coming up with new generations of chipsets on a very rapid basis. But if you got the cadence right with the new generation products, then it was relatively easy to keep the business with a strong momentum. I think with embedded it's very different because one, you're creating a system or a board rather than a chip. Two, you're looking generally at small volume, but very intense engineering required to meet very high, for example, vibration standards or heat or climate and these kind of things as well. So it's a very different mindset, having to deal with a different kind of customer who's looking for a different kind of value from us. So I think that transition certainly took us about 5 years. From an organizational point of view, it's quite challenging, the sense that you're asking engineers to do new types of products and move from their original area of expertise into new areas. From the sales and marketing side, there are also challenges in terms of you're talking to different kind of customers. You're looking at customers who want lead times of 7, maybe 10 years for a product. Whereas before, you're basically coming out with a new generation every 6 months. And they're looking for different values and long-term support. They're looking for extreme levels of reliability and things like that. So from that perspective, it's also a challenge. Marketing as well, right? Because when we were big in chipsets, we were kind of king of the hill. But then essentially a lot of the marketing was quite simple. You had a lot of motherboard manufacturers came up with products. They were doing the marketing for you. If the performance was good and the benchmarks looked good, that was really basically all you had to do. And you could be a marketing genius if you had a great product. Whereas with embedded, your marketing is very different. You're talking to different vertical markets. Each one has a different kind of language. They're looking for something slightly different. Plus the level, say, of excitement around the product is much less. For me, it was actually quite a tough transition. I say with silicon, you're very much the center of attention. Your products are great, so people get excited about you. You have a lot of enthusiasts writing about the products, talking about the products, etc. And suddenly you're moving to a more vertical space where you're talking about solutions, you're talking about longevity, of course you're talking about performance, but in a much more corporate-oriented language, if you like. Yes?
I was just going to say that being on sort of the front line of doing this transition from sort of embedded systems to something that's more B2B focused, more customized. I'm wondering, what was sort of, the impetus behind this transition?
I think, in a sense, because we were mainly in the PC industry, and I think a lot of the PC industry kind of missed the smartphone. When the first smartphone started to come out, PC was still the king, right? And phones were kind of interesting, and you had brand names like Nokia, and you could see the mobility. But the smartphone kind of changed the game in terms of silicon design and a lot of other things, and consumer dynamics, because suddenly before people, PC was their number one machine, and then suddenly the smartphone becomes that. But then also it sort of brought out new usage scenarios. It brought out new uses for mobility, and people want to have a computer all the time. So then out of that came the cloud, and it was initially a consumer cloud. And it was about delivering entertainment, pictures, social media, this kind of content. And then now the corporate or the enterprise side is really starting to take off. And I think that's happened really in the last 3 to 5 years. And really now you're starting to see things speed up beyond sort of pure computing. Suddenly then a customer's not looking for a system anymore, but they also need the cloud connectivity. They also need to start thinking about how do they integrate the functionality of that system into their business operations. So if you look, 4 or 5 years ago, we started to look at mobility, and we started working with a couple of customers in Japan when we started talking about fleet management, if you like. There, the big question was, how do you get a system in a car? How do you get a tablet in a taxi cab? Was the initial problem. And initially, the customer thought, well, it's very simple, right? We just go and buy some tablets, and we install them in the taxis, and then maybe we build a couple of apps, and maybe we have a 3G or whatever. But then suddenly realized that there's a lot more complex than that. For example, if you put a standard Android tablet in a cab, then the taxi driver is going to use it for other purposes than for corporate usage. Second, it'll get dinged about a bit, and so suddenly then you've got issues like reliability over a long period of time. If it's in sunlight for a long time, all these kind of things can happen. So you start having customers looking for more sturdier systems and optimized systems for their usage needs. And I think that's where it really started. It was like with the customer in Japan, then we started to learn about mobility, and we started to learn about what kind of requirements they need from a design side, not just the hardware, but also the software, and then ultimately the cloud integration. So that's become very much a piece. And so if you look at our Mobile 360 line, when we launched the D700 dash cam, I think it's over 2 years ago. Basically at the time, it had a few software features, but it was mainly still hardware, and we kind of viewed it internally as more as a hardware piece. But actually, if you look at the innovation and the development we've done around the products, it's all been software and cloud focused. Customers, if you're going to collect video data, you can't just leave it on an SD card because it really has very limited value. If you're taking a clip of a potential accident, it needs to go immediately. It can't just be saved there. So then you've got connectivity. Then when you've got that data comes back to you, what are you going to do with it? So then you bring in the cloud, and then the cloud has to be able to help you analyze and react very quickly. So I think a lot of the development we've done has been very organic. Customers have these needs. They need to start putting out the so-called edge devices, if you like, but then there's much more to an edge device than simply the local processing. It's got to be connected, and it's got to have an infrastructure or a cloud to process the data that it's generating, or at least the relevant data it wants from the system. I think as we move to 5G, that need is going to get higher and higher, is that the clouds have become a lot more sophisticated. They're going to be able to do a lot more things.
I don't think we can talk about transitions without also talking about some rejection and failure, because they're often siblings. Have you guys experienced any rejection and failure? I'm sure you have, and how have you dealt with it?
I think definitely the transition from silicon design to embedded systems was a huge challenge for the company. And I think one of the reasons why I've enjoyed working with VIA is that as a culture we're very resilient, but also we have a leadership that is very far-sighted, and also actually I think very patient as well. So it's given us time to experiment with new directions, and I think it's taken probably longer than we'd hoped. But now I think we're a much clearer picture of where we're going. So I think when we talk about failure, certainly on a personal level, is one, I think it's very easy to think the world is not going to be there tomorrow, and things are never quite as bad as you think they are, and it's just that things are never quite as good as you think you are. And I think you have to have a sense of realism. I also think you have to be fundamentally optimistic. And it's very easy to, you screw up and guess what, the world doesn't end and you keep on going. And I think as long as you learn from it, it doesn't matter. And then you just make sure you don't repeat the same mistake again, but you also have to accept that there are other challenges that you're going to meet and you're going to fail again in the future. Say marketing, we have a lot of different initiatives. Some of them are very successful, and of course you like to remember what's successful. But then a lot of them fail or they stop halfway through, and you kind of have to spend some time thinking about, well, why did that happen? And you have to look at your own style. One of my weaknesses is sometimes I like to do too much. And so you can say do 5-10 projects when really you should be focusing on 3 or 4. So I think it means you've got to be very honest with yourself.
I think definitely what you're saying about learning from failure, that's really only something that I've actually come to sort of realize on a deeper level in the last, say, 2 or 3 years. Just because, going to uni, it's really something that failure was never an option. Especially with the people that I surrounded myself with. They were all sort of very high achieving, went on to do very good things in life. I think sometimes you fail to realize that the things that you're doing are actually a success, but when you compare yourself too much to the people around you, it feels like a failure.
Right.
And I think the way that I've kind of flipped it on its head is to realize that every day there's a potential failure. Getting used to this cycle of failing and learning does more good for you in the long run compared to always succeeding. Some people have this kind of tendency to sort of view criticism from a colleague or a boss as, this is the end of the world. This is this destroys the workplace relationship or whatever. But I kind of see it as if there are these opportunities for disagreement, which some people misconstrue as failure, I really take that as something that is a good thing. It's something that I want to sort of use, absorb, take this experience and actually run with it to make something that will eventually be a success.
Well, I think certainly from a management point of view, I think one of the key is to sometimes challenge people. I think all of us fall into a set pattern of how we do things. And so sometimes it's good just to sort of try and steer someone in a direction. I think there are companies that kind of like to be confrontational, like that in their culture. And one of the things I like about VIA is that we're actually not that confrontational. And you don't have to be confrontational to have a valuable discussion. But sometimes I do like to maybe throw a curveball in there just to see how people react. And people have done that before me, before to me, and I think it sometimes helps, because the other side of failure is overconfidence, right? And I think with particularly high achievers is that it's very easy to think you're the king of the hill, right? And that you're some kind of genius and you know everything. And actually, a lot of times I think in business, some of it's about hard work and success, but some of it's about pure luck. And I think you have to retain a certain sense of humility. I say when we were big in chipsets, all of us thought, we're amazing, look at us. Stock prices going up, all these customers and everything like that. And then, things changed. And it was actually quite a humbling experience. But looking back on it, it's not one I want to go through again. But I actually think it was actually kind of a very useful experience in the sense that you learn that you're not quite as good as you think you are.
Yeah, I think in many ways I'm very grateful that I've failed in many things in life.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, in school, like I failed like a few classes, as in, you know, outright failures, as in, you know, I got like say 2 out of 100. You know, at the time you think that, oh, this is the end of the world. You know, what will my parents say?
Right.
Will I get into the university that I want to? Will I be kicked out of the university?
Right.
But then in retrospect, I think you kind of realize that these failures are really sort of, you know, these important points where you know, important decisions need to be made. It gives you the sort of information that you can act on to make a decision that will actually be better for you,
Yes.
as opposed to, you know, riding this wave of thinking that sort of a path that maybe society or your parents or you know, just your wider environment has set for you is the right one for you. Failure actually grounds you back in the real world, in my experience. The times that I may fail in, you know, my personal life and work or whatever the case might be, you know, a lot of my friends definitely, they say that, you know, how do you deal with this so well? And I'm like, you know, it happens every day. It's just the reality of life. It's, you know, how you actually deal with it, how you move forward from it that matters.